All right, hi there, everyone. Let's get going. Good morning to those on the West Coast. Happy lunchtime to those people who are joining from Eastern Time Zone, and good afternoon or good evening to those people who are joining from Europe or Australia. So that's actually quite late. We've got actually people from all around the world who've signed up for this. So it's really great to have you here, whether you are here live or whether you're here on the recording. I will explain a little bit about how the recordings are going to work and how today's going to be set up in just a moment. The way it's going to work is mostly a format is I'm going to have a conversation mostly with myself, talking to you directly, but introducing the idea of the psychology of innovation and present some concepts, and we will have a chance to have a Q&A afterwards. I'll go through that right away. And so with that, let's get going. Let's make the most use of your time and start exploring the psychology of innovation. All right. So this is the second in a series of webinars that I'm going to be doing over the next few weeks and months, looking at the art and the science of change. My name is Dr. Cameron Norman. I'm a professional psychologist and designer. I'm an educator. I work in the area of change and design. And this is really has come out of what we're seeing right now in the world. We're seeing a lot of change on a massive level that is unrecognizable to many. Most of us understand the idea of things changing, but we're seeing it globally. We're seeing it in the way we work. We're seeing it with technology. There's some good positive things from this, and there's some real challenges as well. So this is really meant to get you thinking a little bit about how do we change and how do we do it well. And today's webinar is focused on the psychology of innovation, which is really all about change. And we'll get into that in just a minute. So I'm really glad to have you here, and I'm looking forward to sharing some ideas with you and having a chance to have a discussion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first talk a little bit about what I mean by innovation, what I mean about that, not going into a large literature review, talk a little bit about who I am. We're going to talk about kind of 6 pillars of psychology as it relates to innovation and change. We're also going to talk a little bit about mental health and care for innovators, of which I imagine many of you are. That's why you're here. I'll talk a little bit about this concept called the Sense Academy, which I'm launching relatively soon, and we'll have a chance to have a bit of a discussion. I do want to say that the setup is this. There's no tech support team here working there. So if in fact you're having a problem, one of the best ways to do that is to log out and then log back in. As I mentioned, if you're just, or unless you're just joining late, this is being recorded. So there is an opportunity for you to come back to this later on. So you don't have to scribble everything down. You'll have a chance to do that. And I'm going to send you a link to that along with the slides, as well as some other details as well. So some kind of goodies that help you apply some of this into your work and life. But there's no technical support, so my apologies for that. If you do ask questions, feel free to put that in the Q&A section. I will get to them at the end, just to avoid the disruption that can come from going back and forth. And there will be some opportunities for some further engagement as well. So thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate having you here. And let's talk about the reasons why you're here, which is about the psychology of innovation. So let's start with first a definition. So what do I mean by innovation? To me, the definition of innovation is, this is one that I use, is called learning transformed into value by design. It's probably a little different than one that you're used to, but learning, innovation does not have to be anything technical. It doesn't have to be technological. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It's really about learning, about understanding what's going on, but turning it into value, because you can learn about all kinds of different topics, but that becomes trivia, which might be still useful, but it's not something that you're applying to something. And it's into value by design, which means you're intending to do something. Oftentimes we have discoveries that make a big difference to our life, but it's not really until we take something and apply it that it becomes innovation. So the psychology of innovation is really the understanding of the human processes that bring innovation to life. And also those things that support innovators themselves. And that's really what the focus of today's webinar is on. So some of you may have seen the previous webinar, which is up online. You'll have access to that as well. Is this idea about a frame of inquiry? So psychology is one of 3 different components of a frame, a way of seeing and compartmentalizing innovation. And that can be very useful when there's so much going on. Sometimes we need to be able to focus in. And really what psychology does is serve as one of those frames to help us do that. So just a little bit about myself. So why might I be talking about the psychology of innovation? I have worked in this area for my entire career. I trained as a psychologist. My PhD is in behavioral science. I'm a member of the Association of Psychological Science and have been a member of the Canadian Psychological Association for about 25 years now. I've been a professor. I'm an adjunct professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, where I was full-time teaching courses on behavior change for many years, also at OCAD University. But I also do this as practice. And of course, because I'm a human being, I'm applying this stuff to myself all the time. And I always like to recommend things that I've tried myself, and I've tried and I've failed and I've succeeded. So I'll draw a little bit on that. I'm also the principal of Sense Limited and a new project called the Sense Academy. So I think altogether that gives me hopefully you some hope as to why, why might I be able to talk to you about the psychology of innovation. So we're going to do a little interactive poll here. So what I want to do is just ask you a little bit about what represents psychology to you, or rather, who represents psychology to you. Psychology has got a lot of different conceptions around them, and none of them are particularly right or wrong. I just want to get a sense from you as an audience. What do you think is who represents psychology to you? So I'm just going to launch a poll there. Just feel free to vote right now, and we'll see. We'll see what people think about. You've also got an other if something there, but if there's something that jumps out to you, what do you think? Okay, the votes are coming in. All right, okay, so I'm just going to end the poll right now, and let's see what we've got. Sharing the results. So when you look at that, the winner is other. I'm really interested to hear what that is. Maybe you can put that in the chat feature, and we can talk a little bit about that a little later. We will come back to this. So when you think about psychology, it is a very large field, and it is a very diverse field. And sometimes when you think about psychology, sometimes you're thinking about rats and mazes. How do we train people to go through mazes and do tricks and press levers? That's part of psychology. Sigmund Freud probably was the poster doctor for many years in terms of the Freudian and analytical approach. Dr. Phil, nobody picked Dr. Phil. There's the self-help guru of sort, and his compatriot Oprah Winfrey. Sometimes people will often think about her and some of the book clubs that she's had. Somebody picked Dr. Fraser Crane, the self-help sort of broadcaster from Fraser. Tony Robbins, motivational speaker. And then many people picked others. So it's really interesting to see those things, because there are a lot of different conceptions for what it means to be a psychologist. So thank you for all those who did vote, and let's take a look and see what does that actually look like in practice. So I've broken down psychology into 6 domains, and this is just my approach to doing this, just to make this accessible. You can do entire PhDs in psychology and still not hit the entire breadth and depth of the field. But today we're really focusing it on innovation. And for that, I've got 6 different domains that we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about perception. We'll talk about thoughts or cognition, the way we think about things and innovation. We're going to talk about the emotional aspect, those feelings. We're talking about, obviously, behavior. It's got to come in there somewhere. We'll also talk about personality, which is one of the things I think people find most exciting and interesting when I talk about innovation and teach that. And the last piece is the social component. So how do we get something that is how do we turn this into a social component, not just about individuals? So let's see where we go from here. So So before I go into anywhere, one of the things I want to say is one very large caveat about psychology. And there's something that I've been talking about for most of my career, and thankfully, I'm not the only one who's been talking about it. 2010, a paper came out from some psychologists at the University of British Columbia, and they talked about this idea about psychology being weird. Now, what weird means is, it's an acronym that stands for Western, and I would say white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. That is where the bulk of the knowledge about psychology, and a lot of other disciplines as well, comes from. Now, that does not invalidate the findings, but what it means is that we need to be very careful about applying what we know from psychology to other contexts and situations. So populations that are not white, that are not in the Western world, that aren't rich, that aren't industrialized or long industrialized nations, that aren't wealthy, democratic, those sorts of things. So please keep that in mind when we go through that. The examples that I'm going to present are ones that have some robustness, but not perfect robustness in terms of being able to show examples of how psychology can be applied. So always keep that in the back of your mind, that these are ideas and concepts that come from a large research body that is international, but it's also highly contextualized. We could spend the entire time talking about that, but I just want to put that as a caveat before we go too far. So let's start out with perception, how we perceive. This may be one of the biggest challenges facing anybody who's doing innovation, is this idea about perceiving, both how we as individuals perceive problems, but how we as innovators help others to see the value of our products and sources. So one of the things that innovation is all about is really seeking patterns within a larger context. I mean, that's really what perception is. It's also about us understanding how we see things, and it matters as much as what we see. Now, if you take a look at this card here, it's the 8 of diamonds, but if you take a much closer look, you will actually see there's an 8 embedded within that. Sometimes you'll see it, and sometimes it's just there. It's hidden in plain sight. So how does this apply in practice? One of the big lessons out there is actually understanding gorillas. This is a slice of lung tissue. This is from a study that was done in 2013 involving radiologists. And radiologists, for those of you who don't know, effectively are experts at looking at slices of tissue to be able to detect cancerous cells and growths within a slice. This is one of the slices that was presented to the radiologist group of 24, so a stack of slices. So they went through a number of these things to try and find, they're looking for misshapen nodules. Does anybody here see anything unusual in this image? Even if you're not a radiologist, you can probably pick out what's a little different. Maybe if we zoom in a little bit, how about now? Yes, what you can start to see here is that there is a gorilla. Yes, there is a gorilla embedded within this image. The gorilla, just for a scale, was 48 times larger than the nodule that radiologists were looking for. So if you were actually to look at say, the finger or thumb of the gorilla, that's what they're staring at. So this is not a subtle gorilla. But what they found was 83% of radiologists did not see the gorilla when they went through these slices. Now, just to validate this, eye tracking tools were used as part of that, so almost like a camera, to see where their eyes were looking. This is a technique that's often used in user design research for websites and technology. What they found is that most of those who looked at, the radiologists involved, looked directly at the gorilla and didn't see it. It was hidden in plain sight. So what this basically tells us is that expertise and experience can reveal patterns, but it can also conceal them. They were so intent on looking for some very small patterns They didn't see something sitting right in front of them. And it's an interesting thing from an innovation perspective is as innovators, often we have ideas and we're trying to get people to see them. They can't see the problem that's right in plain sight. They can't see the potential, the solution in plain sight. So it's something for us to consider, that it's not just that maybe we're not communicating well, it's that other people literally cannot see that. So putting perception into practice is one of the things is that innovative ideas are rarely obvious. In fact, a lot of great innovations that we have now were ones that were invented a long time ago. In fact, actually, there's been analysis of things like science fiction that has shown things like Jules Verne and other authors hundreds of years ago, or 100 years ago, predicted a lot of technologies that we're using today. And actually, the inverse is also true, because sometimes people can see what happened, they can actually apply it later on. Perception is also affected by prior experience and focus. Those radiologists were not blind. They knew what they were very well trained, but the thing, they were trained on something so small, it never occurred to them to look at something much larger. You and I might look at the larger shape. So there's an opportunity to be able to see a better picture frame. So thinking about this as an innovator, if you've got a product or service, how do you get people to think a little bit differently about the level of focus that they've got? There's some exercises that you can do, for example, a zoom in, zoom out technique, that you take any particular topic or issue and you have people drill down deeply into this. At the same time, you have them bring back. We see this in organizations, for example. Anybody who's ever seen a television show called Undercover Boss, and I believe there's versions of it all around the world, is that what the boss does is get a chance to go undercover and see roles and responsibilities associated with particular jobs. For he or she, they're going deep into perspective. I often think we often need to bring people from front lines to the executive suite, because they also start to see how decisions are made and what executives see and perceive. Mindfulness programs can work incredibly well. What mindfulness does is allows you to quiet a lot of the noise and attend to things. I do this in workshops all the time. I have people do mindfulness exercise, and it goes over, sometimes people are wondering, what does this have to do with innovation? But by just quieting the mind, even just for a minute, they start to notice things they hadn't noticed before. Maybe it's their stomach rumbling. That might be a signal that they're hungry. They might hear the HVAC system, something like that, that they didn't notice before. And it's a pretty benign opportunity, but it does give them a chance to be able to see something. And then lastly, a tool called empathy maps. And empathy maps can be, what does the world look like from a particular perspective? One of the tools that I often recommend is something called the day in the life. And really what it is telling a story of your potential user, of your product, walk them through a typical day for them. From the very moment they wake up to the end of their day, you'll get a sense of understanding what that person might be living with or living like. So let's talk personality. So this is something that's quite, again, also quite a popular thing. We've got a little bit of a poll here. A lot of people, when they hear about personality, they think about personality tests. So let's do a little bit of a poll here and see what people think here. Oops, just sorry about that. I've got a poll here. So 2 questions. Have you ever taken a personality test? Yes or no? And what did you think about that personality test when you did it? So I'm just going to, oops, there we go. There. So it's up there. Okay, a couple more people still voting. All right, so we'll close the poll and let's see what people who voted for. All right, so let's take a look at the results here. So have you taken a personality test? 100% of people who voted said yes. So they are very popular. Sometimes they are official ones done by a psychologist or organizational change professional. Sometimes they could be something online. Be interesting to hear a little bit about where and what people talk about. So let's take a look at what you think about that personality test. Well, nobody thought it was a waste of time, but the majority of those people who voted found it interesting, but largely not useful. Some people, it helped them understand others, and other people, it helped them understand themselves. So personality tests are really quite interesting. And what is interesting about a personality test is it starts to tap into patterns of behavior and preferences. And that's ultimately what personality and personality theory is. And so why might that matter for innovation? Well, one of the things is that oftentimes innovators, those people who are trying to do something new, trying to promote learning, trying to create action, very often get frustrated. This idea about I've got a great idea, I've got a solution, I see a problem. Why don't other people see, experience what I do? Now, of course, that has to do with a lot of different things, and some of those are perception, as we've just covered, but some of it's also around personality, and there's preferences around this. So one of the things is that there is 5 major personality traits that have been discovered. Now, I want to just stop for a moment here. Research on personality is incredibly broad. People find it fascinating to understand why people do what they do. And the research tends to be pretty robust in being able to show that these 5 traits do exist. What is more problematic is that the ability to predict and control those things. The research there is not necessarily as strong. Now, just because something doesn't have a lot of scientific basis doesn't necessarily mean it can't be useful. And I'm just going to go through a couple examples here. But for the big 5 is really this idea about openness to experience. Some people are more somewhat small c conservative, and some people are much more open to trying new things and doing different things. Conscientiousness is that ability to think about others, that the degree to which you think about others and in guiding your actions. Extroversion, this is probably the most popular domain, is extroversion or introvert. Those who've read Susan Cain's book, Introvert, know a lot about that idea about introversion versus extroversion. So the shorthand way is that do you derive more energy from others, or do you derive more energy from yourself? So one being the self is more introvert, extrovert others. That's a bit of a simplistic way of doing that. Agreeableness is the ability to work with others and collaborate with others and share things. And neuroticism is this idea about whether you're much more stable or much more volatile. And that doesn't have to be a negative thing. It's much more, you've got a much broader range of experiences and patterns in your behavior. So probably the most popular and the widest used by far is the Myers-Briggs Personality Inventory. There's just like horoscopes were big in the 70s and 60s, this is the thing that oftentimes people say is that I'm an ISFP, I'm an ENFJ, that sort of thing, and people will lump themselves into these kinds of categories. The evidence for these types of categories is not very strong, but at the same time, it does get people talking and gets them to think a little bit about these kinds of ideas. So these, for example, are some of the caricatures that are drawn from each one of these types of personality categories, which you might find. This is another popular one. This has been around since the 40s. This is the DISC model, and there are a ton of inventories that use a 2x2 matrix of some sort. The idea of these kinds of qualities in terms of decision making. So you might find these of potential interest. This is one that I've actually used in work, and I've actually used in training, and it has been used with me. And this is the Bassett profile. This has actually been very well studied. And what this is around work preferences. So preferences are what graft onto personality. So the reason why this might be important, and I'm going to show this particular one, is because it can help you to understand both how ideas are adopted, but also how ideas are generated. So if you are trying to look to foster innovation within your organization, you might want to think a little bit about these kinds of categories. The Bassett profile starts out in the top right left-hand quadrant with the generator, somebody who loves ideas. Oftentimes we call them ideators, so the people who have an abundance of ideas and creativity. They often get trapped in those ideas. They keep wanting to generate new ideas. The conceptualizer is somebody who starts to think a little bit about what is the problem we are trying to solve. And keeping in mind, like all of these, is that people have aspects of all of that, just like any one of these personality tests, but there's ones that may be dominant. So they're the ones who are going to constantly saying, what are we trying to do here? An optimizer is the idea of saying, how do we take something and turn it into a practical? So they're often the ones who are going to be creating, trying to integrate. Oftentimes they get called integrators. How do we take all the stuff that we learn and turn it into something? And the implementers are the doers. The implementers and generators are the ones that are often people that are often easiest to characterize. An implementer, at its worst, will take the first idea that they get and run with it. To the other pole, a conceptualizer is the person that says, we don't have enough research. We need to keep understanding the problem. I think a lot of us can probably relate to a lot of these categories with people that we've worked with. What these kinds of tools can do is help you classify people, to not necessarily put labels on people, but to help you identify preferences in the way people work, think, and act, to help you organize your innovation projects. So affecting personality innovation, how do you turn this into action? Well, one of the things is understanding that categorization can be helpful. People love to talk about it. It helps you engage people. It gets people thinking about innovation, the bigger mission, that sort of thing. So it can be very useful in that. It's a great conversation starter. But it has to have some utility. So we need to be able to anchor personality and work preferences to teams and tasks. So rather than just simply assign people based on skill, it's also worthwhile understanding, what do you prefer to do? Because those are the things that are going to drive your attraction to this thing, and it's also going to get you engaged. So that's always one of the big things that innovators face, is how do you get people behind this project? I always want to say beware of overgeneralizations. These are categories. They can be applied as labels. They can also put people into boxes. We don't want to get to that point. And it's always important to remember that personalities are based on a continuum. They are considered traits. And there's some debate and argument around that. But the idea is that they exist on a continuum, that we're not just one of these things, and they are affected by states. I think to come back to the idea of introversion and extroversion, there's times where I just want to stay home and I don't want to do anything. And there's times where I just want to be with people. Both of those are different sides of me, but one represents a more extroverted side and one represents a more introverted side. But these things do shape our behavior. So it's something to think about. So the next thing is cognition, the thoughts. And this is one of the things that innovators have to come up with all the time. Oftentimes the idea is that I've got a great idea. Can't you see what the problem is? And here's my suggestion. Here's my product. Here's the service. Here's the thing we need to do if you only see this. But if that was the case, we'd have a lot fewer problems. Right now, we are faced with a global pandemic. And the epidemiology, while it is evolving, is relatively stable and consistent. Recommendations are reasonably simple at a personal level. The idea of wearing a mask, keeping some type of distance, not gathering with other people for too long, washing your hands, that sort of thing like that. If that was all it was, we wouldn't have people resisting. It's not just about the science, it's about people starting to think about, well, what does it mean for me? And how do I make a decision? And we all know that we're in situations where we often make a decision where we start to think, maybe the risk has changed. So we're thinking differently. Do I need to be doing this now, or do I need to be doing it later? Oops. So one of the things comes down to decision making. And one of the things that people often don't realize, or you may know if you've taken biology, is that every decision we make, every thought we make is powered by something. And that thing is glucose. So every time you make a decision, you're using a little bit of glucose in your brain to fuel that decision. Now, the decision not to do something is also a decision as well. So you can't avoid decisions. But interestingly enough is that the more glucose we use, the more we start to get depletion. And there's this thing called decision fatigue. So anybody who knows much about Steve Jobs often knows him as almost a caricature, blue jeans and a black turtleneck. Now, it wasn't the same one. He just simply said, I'm just going to buy a whole rack of my favorite turtleneck and blue jeans. One of the reasons was so it was one less decision he had to make in a day. Which is an interesting thing, is he didn't want to have his important decision-making tool, his brain, be fatigued when he went into the office or was in a creative state. So he reduced one more decision he had to make. It was made for him. One of the things as innovators we need to think about is how do we reduce the number of decisions people have to make to use our product or service? How can we make it as simple as possible? It also depends not just on what we do, but it also depends on when we do. Dan Pink, who has written a lot on psychology in a lot of different ways, is a great synthesizer of evidence. And his latest book on when is a great one because he talks a lot about when decisions are made. This is an example from his book, looking at the Hospital of Doom. And just as a personal recommendation from him through me to you is that if you're going in for a major procedure, you probably want to see your doctor first thing in the morning rather than first thing in the afternoon. This graphic starts to illustrate some of the challenges that people make. Tons of studies on a variety of different contexts show that even if you're considering yourself to be a morning person or an evening person, or you work at different times of day, most people tend to have a lull right after lunch. Some people are strong in the afternoon and some people are stronger in the morning, but right after lunch. So early afternoon is not our best time to make a decision. So if you think about this as an innovator, there's multiple ways to think about it. One is if you've got a team, probably the idea of analyzing some deep data points that you're using to make a decision, probably something you might want to do in the early part of the day, not right after lunch. On the other hand is if you're trying to access people from a marketing standpoint when they're somewhat at their vulnerable, and I would hope people would be responsible about this, early afternoon might not be a bad time to do that. It also might be a good time to do things that are much more mundane and administrative, like correspondence or something like that. The other thing about of our mind and cognitions is that there are mind frames that guide what we do. And what you may find is that there's what we see and then what goes on underneath that. So what we see are these systems manifest events, things happen. But what's going on are patterns. And sometimes we see something and go, I've seen this multiple times. I've seen it in different ways. What's the pattern behind this? And then underneath that, what might be the structures that guide it? So really thinking about this like an iceberg is that what we see is up top, there's a lot more underneath that. So for innovators, it's really important for us to be able to understand a little bit about what does this mean in practice. So some of the strategies, how do I take this and use it? First of all, understanding that our world is based on experience, it's based on habits, and it's based on patterns, not just information. Giving people more information about what it is that you do, how you do it, what the problems are, only works to a certain extent. At some point, you need to think about other ways of crafting a story around what it is people do. Decision fatigue. Try to make your decisions as compressed as possible. Reduce the number that you can. Think about this as from a personal standpoint. You want to make your most important decisions while you're fresh, earlier in the day, or after a rest, or after a time of a recharge than you do in the middle of something else. So a lot of your organizational policies might be better attuned to the calendar and the clock rather than the people in the room. The other thing is energy level. As I said, glucose gets depleted. This is why making sure that you've got good, strong energy in your teams and in yourself to be able to do the work. Because anybody who's tried to make any type of change happen realizes it's never easy. As I mentioned in my last webinar, is that change is a difficult thing. If it was easy, we would all be doing it all the time. And we wouldn't have many of the challenges we face as organizations, as communities, and as individuals. So one of the things is also to foster some questions. So that last piece about the iceberg is ask yourself when you see things. Is this an event? Is this a pattern? And is there a structure underlying that? In most cases, the answer is going to be yes to the last two. Obviously, an event is whether it's a one-off or something like that. As if you're looking for opportunities, there's a great place to do that. Okay, emotions. We're getting through this. So emotions right now, obviously a very big thing right now. A lot of us are either isolated or isolated certainly from our normal behavior. So how do we address some of these things? Emotions, again, facts are great, but people make decisions based on emotions with facts. So thinking about that from marketers, and marketers know this, they know that ability to get people excited, passionate. You need to tap into emotions. So I'm not going to say a lot about this, but one of the things, and I always like, anytime I can use any Star Wars reference, I will. But from an innovator's perspective, one of the things is to think about the force. And I don't mean this mystical energy field that allows us to levitate and read people's minds and control things. What I mean is that thinking about what attracts people and repulses people. This is where doing your research really counts. So whether you are running a restaurant, whether you're running a shop, whether you are running an accounting firm, watch where people gravitate to. What are the areas of attraction that people gather around? Anybody who's ever hosted a party knows this law firsthand, is that you can have the most beautiful home, but probably if you're having people inside, which is probably not something we're doing a lot these days, is that where does a lot of traffic go? The kitchen. Everywhere I've been across the world, when I've been to some sort of social gathering in someone's home, the kitchen is a hotspot. Why? There's food, there's drink, and there's creativity because people are putting things together. Those are great spaces to organize around. You can have this elaborate living room, but you're going to get just as much traffic in the kitchen, even if somebody's being hosted. Think about what is attracting people and what is repulsing people. So for managing emotions, think about having a process in place. Research has shown that people who are prepared for problems do better. They respond to failure better. They learn from failure more often. Now, that doesn't mean that your plan has to be successful. What it does mean is that you're thinking ahead. So from an emotional standpoint, we feel more certain when we have a strategy in place to do something. So as an innovator, you want to think about how do you identify trends, spot patterns, and how do you generate new ideas? Not just do it haphazardly, but use something like design thinking, those kinds of approaches to help generate those ideas, synthesize them, and translate them into products and services, rather than doing it haphazardly. So you can reduce the amount of fear, which people do not learn well under fearful conditions, and it helps them recover from failure. Focus on the attractors and the repulsors, what keeps people away from something and what draws them to it. So these are emotional leverage points. And I want to use this responsibly, not to trigger people unnecessarily, but the idea of using leverage points to say, here's what people are really interested in, can we build around that? And then find meaning. We are our stories, but we're not only our stories. So people may be looking at things, having emotionally laden reactions to certain things, positively or negatively, but we're not just those stories. So we can actually build those things in advance. So just a couple more things here, and then we'll have a chance to have some questions. So behavior. Behavior is this is sort of the keystone thing. People think about, well, does somebody actually do something? That's obviously a big part of psychology. That's been a lot of the work that I have done as a professional, is look at this. And what I'm going to do is introduce just something really simple here. And this was originally started by a mentor of mine, Dr. Harvey Skinner, who synthesized a lot of the evidence out there on behavior change. And there is a lot of evidence. Looked at different models, particularly around health. If we abstract that to where we are right now, one of the things that we can find is that there's some real keys. And the keys aren't one single thing, rather it's an index. So the more of these things you can have in place, the more likely it is that somebody's going to change their behavior. So whether that change of behavior is adopting your new idea or technology or tool or process, or whether it's adopting the idea of being innovative, or it's making a change in your personal life. These are things that the more you have, the more you can check these things off, the more likely it is to happen, which means it also gives us areas that we can work on. Number one, knowledge and skills. Those are the most straightforward ones. Public health, for example, has no shortage of people who want to quit smoking, exercise more, in this case, caring for themselves, their behavior around COVID-19. One of the criticisms that I make of public health is that it relies so much on information. It needs to have not just knowledge and skills, but you've got to be able to go further than that. Secondly, you have to think about yourself as personally susceptible to a problem. Do you have an innovation that people just don't feel they need? The great innovators are ones that are able to show, here's how you might need something by thinking in terms of the future or alternative possibilities, not just the present. You need to think it serious. You may be sitting there thinking, do I really need a new X, Y, or Z, or do we need a new process? If you don't think it's a serious problem, you're probably not going to invest a lot of energy in solving that problem. You've got to think that even if you do think about this, whatever you're going to do differently is going to give you more advantages than less. So the pros and cons about doing something like this, like even if we think about the pandemic right now, the pros to taking all the public health guidance is we're going to keep ourselves safe, we're going to keep our families safe and our communities safe. The cons, we're stuck at home. A lot of Netflix, movies, books. We're having to rely much more on our small neighbor, our immediate family, and ourselves to manage. And that's a challenge. You also have to believe others endorse actions. We're going to talk a lot about the social norms. So what are other people doing? What we find is the more people comply with the public health guidelines, the more likely people are to comply with public health guidelines. The more people use a certain product, the more likely others are going to use that product. And of course, you've got to care what other people think. And this is an interesting, there's lots of interesting research that there's people out there who can see all these things, but if you don't really care what others think genuinely on a particular issue, you're much less likely to change. So how do we do this? So one of the things is behavioral activation is really a big thing. And oftentimes we think knowledge precedes action. But oftentimes there's actually research that says sometimes just getting people to act. We find particularly people who are battling depression, the idea of thinking going out, being social is one of the best ways to reduce depressive symptoms. But when you're depressed, you don't feel like that at all. So oftentimes what cognitive behavioral therapists will try and do is they just go out anyways. Go out and be social. And I've seen this firsthand, is that people will, despite the fact of not wanting to go out and be social, actually find that their mood elevates. Things are really good by acting before thinking. So sometimes we need to think before we act. Sometimes we need to act before we think. Evaluate the outcomes. Nothing succeeds like success. So the more you can do something and capture that. So if you're doing a design thinking or a design sprint or anything like that, we'll get into the techniques for another day. If you do a design process and you yield certain kinds of outcomes, capture them. Because the more successful you are, the more you can learn how to continue on. Failure is a good teacher. Success is actually a better one. And the evidence points to that. And find those levers. I'll use that term a lot of times. A lever, if there's something that you can figure out, somebody who's at a different stage of readiness. Some people are not even thinking about making a change. And some people are actually right on the cusp. So tailor your messaging, tailor your work to that. Okay, and the last thing is smallest visible actions. I want to leave you with that one, is that rather than try and change everything, change one very small thing that you can accomplish and that you can turn into something useful over time. Social psychology. So we've got one more topic, and then we're going to get a chance to have a bit of a conversation and see a little bit about what you're thinking. So we are social beings, so are squirrels. And one of the things that psychologists have learned a lot about, and other behavioral scientists, is the power of our social life. As much as anyone likes to think that they are independent and they control their own destiny, the truth is that we're much less than we often think. We are social beings. It's one of the reasons why COVID-19 has been so difficult for so many people. is that you start to realize, yeah, it really is actually useful to see my barista at a coffee shop down the street. Oh, it's really nice to see my neighbors walking around. Oh, the person who's got the desk 3 doors down from me, all of a sudden their meaning has a much bigger play when you haven't had a chance to see them or interact with them. So we do know that there's enormous evidence to suggest we're social beings, which means that as innovators, we need to think a little bit about how do we design for the social world and how do we use that social world to influence us. This is an example from something that you may have heard as this idea about behavioral economics. And this is basically those who've taken economic decisions and applied psychology to it. Sometimes people call these things nudges. So this is an example of trying to make a decision about how to use more green energy. So there's a lot of research that's been done on energy use, for example. How do you get people to make changes in terms of reducing their energy consumption, buying more green energy, using more green energy sources, reducing waste, that sort of thing. One of the ways that you can do that is actually showing not just how well you're doing, but also how you're doing in comparison to your neighbors. And there's an enormous body of evidence, and this is one of the studies, that shows by visually presenting data that says, here's how you're doing, here's how the average person is doing, and here's how the best person is doing, you can make a real change. And if you look at this dashboard here, what you see in the top left-hand corner is what the most efficient neighbors have, 707 kilowatts, what this particular person has, and then what other neighbors are what the average is. So it says, hey, you're doing better than the average, but you still could do better. And oftentimes we hear about this idea about gamifying things. This is one of the ways to do it. So play it up and say, listen, do you want to be the top person in your neighborhood? You can design these sorts of things to help people understand how to take an idea and bring it forward. In this case here, you've got the 12-month neighbor comparison, so you can start to see where you fit along that data. It's an incredibly powerful tool and can work exceptionally well for some specific situations. Another thing to think about is also understanding the game. So the game, I mean, is the rules, the structures, the process, and the boundaries around what it is that you're doing. James Carse initiated some of this thinking. Simon Sinek has since developed a great book, a really accessible book that looks at this idea about the infinite game. And the idea behind games is that there's two types, infinite and finite. That, you know, what kind of game we're playing, it depends on whether or not there's a winner or loser. And that's can be quite interesting to help people understand how we organize things within that structure. But there's also another thing. It also has to do with networks. So I'll give you some references to the infinite game, but what I want to talk about is how the game is actually played. And interestingly, networks are really quite important, is how we connect with others and how we play them. So if you compare two different sports, you can start to see ways to be successful and make innovations happen within an organization. So for example, take basketball. Basketball is what you call a strong network sport versus soccer, which is a weak network sport. So it comes down to the question is that what's more important? Should you spend energy improving your weakest link or amplifying your strongest link? That depends on which game you're playing. In basketball, the data shows pretty consistently, if you have a superstar or two, maybe three on your team, you are much more likely to win the NBA championship than you are if you don't have one of the top scorers, you know, on your team. It's very rare for that to happen. Conversely, soccer, you can have the absolute best player in the sport. You can have multiple best players, but your success depends on the weakest link in your team. Soccer is all about a bunch of small decisions, and no player, no matter how talented they are, can run the field and continually do everything. They have to make a number of decisions. If your weakest link is making poor decisions, it's easy for another team to score. In basketball, you can have a superstar like LeBron James who can single-handedly score 60 points, which is often more than half of the entire team. So know what game you're playing and what kind of team and connection you have to understand a little bit about whether you need to spend energy investing in your weakest link or your strongest link. So some recommendations are, From this, show comparisons. See how you're doing and how your competitors are doing. Help your customers, clients see how they're doing relative to others to help them make some decisions. Understanding the norms, the idea of finding your tribe, people who are much like you. The more you can generate some connections together with people, the more likely you're going to be develop momentum, which is something that social organizations thrive on. Know the game you're playing. Strong and weak networks have a huge difference in terms of how you perform. If you, for example, run a restaurant, for example, people may come in multiple times. That's a weak network thing. You want all of your staff to be at a minimum level of performance. Otherwise, one bad meal and somebody's gone. Whereas if you're looking for a coach, you're looking for a coaching team, you may want the strongest person possible. So those are some examples. And make the invisible visible. We saw some examples of using data to help showcase how people make some decisions. So before we go and we take some questions, I want to talk a little bit about the innovators themselves and just to leave a little bit with the idea of the psychology applied to innovation itself. This might be a challenge for many of you right now, more than ever, but it might certainly is a challenge for the work that's done. Being an innovator can be a very lonely proposition. So think a little bit around sled dogs. There's a great article in the New York Times, which I'll be sharing with everyone. I'm talking about the idea of sled dogs and what the lesson of sled dogs is. If you know anything about sled dogs, is dogs run full tilt. And the thing is the dogs don't know how long they're going. And if you look at the Iditarod, it is a multi-day, multi-week event. You cannot have dogs run full tilt for multiple days in a row. So what people need to do is be able to manage that. And right now, there's a great scenario, a great in a terrible way, of the pandemic. We don't know when it's going to end, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Running full tilt to try and survive is not a wise long-term solution. So one of the things is that the recommendations are from whether it's sled dogs or high performance organizations is build your bed before you have to sleep in it. Take those rests. Take time for yourself. Check, avoid the temptation to keep driving forward, because if it's a long game, to use that game analogy again, you may fail when you need to. Another way to think about this is also to model the behavior you want to be. So you may be really tired, you may be exhausted, you may be disheartened, but there's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that as a temporary fix, if you need to get up, maybe the example is if you're working at home, put on a really good outfit. Dress like you're going into the office. Dress like you're going to be there for successful. The idea of being in sweatpants does not invoke a lot of confidence in things, despite the fact is that there's nothing special about a suit and tie, a nice dress, some great shoes versus sweatpants. But doing that can help you change. So you've heard the term fake it till you make it. Sometimes that idea of acting before you think, to come back to an earlier point, is often the way to go. So one of the ways to do this is develop some principles, some things that can adapt over time. These are the ideas about the things that you are willing to do and not willing to do. They don't have to be specific. They just need to be things that guide you. So when you have tough times, you know what to prioritize. Build that preparedness plan. Same thing as we saw earlier, is this idea about be prepared for what's coming. So think about some various scenarios and how you might envision things. So it makes it easier when things don't go according to plan, you can adapt. Compassion, self-awareness, openness is really important. Bias for action, do not try. Do things, but do it with compassion. If you fail, that's fine. Try again. And build your craft. And we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about this. Right now, I just want to say a couple of things is that I'm starting this program called the Sense Academy, and really what this is going to be is developing these things further through webinars and structured courses. If you're interested, there's a few more events coming up. You can learn more at the Sense Academy. That is being developed unveiled much more over the next couple of months, including a full course that looks on Innovation 101. So registration details are going to be posted relatively soon. With that, what I'd like to do now is actually just take a little bit of time and just take a chance just to have some questions. So feel free to right now ask some questions in the Q&A. We don't have the ability to open up mics, or the chat room if you've got any questions about what you've seen or heard. Any thoughts in terms of what I did see? Actually, interesting. I was looking at the chat room. Philip Zimbardo, obviously a legendary psychologist. Thank you, Kevin, for mentioning him. Dr. Z, I've had an interesting experiences with Dr. Z. I met him a few years ago before he passed away at the American Psychological Association. Almost accidentally pushed him down an escalator. Not by intention, but that's maybe a story for another day. Yeah, so Kevin, the idea of no bias to action is not the same as running fast for solution. Absolutely. The idea about bias towards action is tied to this idea about reserving yourself for, sometimes we want to get into that habit of overthinking things through. Sometimes it's helpful just to jump in there. What it doesn't do is dictate things like speed, and it's not necessarily the same thing as going in for a sprint or trying to iterate things relatively quickly. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you at a webinar again sometime soon. Take care.